Hi, so I, 28 female, have been estranged from my parents for almost 7 years now. I cut ties with them after my grandpa passed away, and my mother decided to let my stepdad take over the local bookstore that they ran. My father passed away when I was 3 years old from a sudden heart attack. Nobody had seen it coming, and everyone was left in shock when it happened. My father's parents cut ties with my mom soon after his demise, and she never saw them again. My grandparents took my mother and me in, and we lived with them for the first couple of years after my father's passing. She had been a stay-at-home mom ever since she gave birth to me, so it had been difficult for her to find a job. Even when she did find one, it was a low-paying position, and she had to work twice as hard to earn the same commission and bring home sufficient income. She could have run the bookstore with her parents, but she believed that it wouldn't have a great payout in the long run and was more of a hobby than an actual job. Anyway, she worked as a saleswoman for a stationery company, and in a couple of years she had saved enough to get a place of her own. So when I was around 6 or maybe 7 years old, we moved out of my grandparents' house and into a place of our own. Up until then, it was just me and my mother because she was too focused on her work to divert her energy anywhere else. Besides, she still loved my dad way too much, and I would often catch her looking at photos of him and crying, but after we got a place of our own, she started dating other people. I'll admit it, I was a little upset about it at first because I thought that she was going to start putting me second. I don't know why I felt that way. Maybe it was just a gut feeling, but I just felt like something bad was going to happen if she started dating other men. I used to think these things, but I never let it affect my behavior, and I was always nice to her boyfriends. I also didn't let my mother ever suspect that I felt a little weird about the number of boyfriends she would bring home. I'm a progressive woman myself, and I have had my share of flings and casual relationships, but I also think that if I had a child, I would probably think twice before bringing everybody home. I don't know why it never occurred to my mother. All I knew was that every other week there would be a different guy. I don't know exactly what she was trying to do, but I didn't have a good feeling about it. I stayed quiet about it because I didn't want to make my mother feel bad, but she had worked really hard and she had grieved enough. And also, I was just a kid, so I didn't know how to express myself accurately without sounding like an idiot. So I just never said anything because I was scared of hurting my mom's feelings. Then, when I was around 12 years old, she started dating Stephen, and initially, he seemed like a nice guy. He came over a couple of times and we got along well. He was nice to me, and that was it. I expected, just like other relationships, this would probably also not last for more than a couple of weeks, and it would fizzle out soon enough. But surprisingly, months passed and they continued to see each other. He would come over more often once they started getting serious, and occasionally he would even have dinner and spend the night at our place. Naturally, I started interacting with him a little more. I realized that he was quite different from the guy that my mother used to date before. Unlike the others, he also seemed serious about my mother. I liked that about him, but I also got a very strange vibe from him. After meeting him, my mother started changing certain things about herself, and I was pretty sure that it was for his sake. He had a very dominating and assertive kind of personality, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But for some reason, my mother was a little too submissive, and I had picked up on her weird behavior around him. Whenever he would come over, she would turn into a different person altogether, and it felt like I didn't even know who I was talking to. She would try her best to agree with him on everything, and it honestly felt like I was watching a smitten teenager trying to impress the senior at high school. It was weird, and any time I would be around them, I would feel like I was intruding on something very personal, even if they were just sitting around doing nothing. I had never seen my mother that way, even with the other guys that she had dated before this. She seemed to like them, sure, but she never put in a real effort to change herself and make herself more likable or whatever. But she did that with Stephen, and I didn't feel good about it. But again, I was just a kid at the time, and even though I had felt that something was off, I couldn't exactly bring it up and talk to her about it. She was my mother. And there were certain things that I couldn't talk to her about simply because they were inappropriate for a 12-year-old to say. So once again, I chose to not say anything about it and kept my mouth shut. Even when my grandparents would come around, I would never bring up her strange behavior and her new boyfriend. They did ask me a couple of times about how they were getting along and if I liked him or not, and I always gave them answers that I knew my mother would approve of. After dating for about a year, Stephen moved in with us, and that's when things really started changing around the house. For instance, he changed all the decorations around our house and made them more gender neutral, as he himself put it. Now, it would have made sense if all the decorations in our house were pink, frilly, and feminine, but that was not the case. It was already pretty neutral, in my opinion. We had done up our place pretty normally, like everyone else, but for some reason that seemed to be very hyper feminine to him. And he came along and changed everything about our house and made it all hyper masculine instead. By the time we were done redecorating our house, it literally looked like a bachelor pad. He was quite impressed with it and said that it finally reminded him of home. I don't understand how that was a good thing because before that, he used to live with a bunch of roommates who were younger than him. I wanted to complain about it, but I didn't because my mother told me not to, and my room had remained untouched, so it was okay. But then slowly he started changing other things as well. He got my mother to stop eating meat because he read somewhere it was not good for the body and he didn't want my mother to gain weight and become unhealthy in the future. So both of them switched to being vegetarian and they tried to get me to switch as well. Thankfully, I was actually at school and I told them that I needed the protein to keep up, so they didn't force me much. I wouldn't say that was a bad change, but my mother had been the biggest fan of hamburgers and all things meaty before she met Stephen, so it was a huge sacrifice and she was making. He also forced her to go off of sugar, and that made her immensely cranky, which is not good for me because she would never get mad at him, but would snap at me for the smallest things. There were also a lot of other healthy lifestyle changes that he incorporated into their life, but honestly, it was all just random stuff that he would read on the internet and make everyone paranoid about it by building it up in his own head. He was a really weird man, but my mom seemed to like him, and as long as he was happy, I didn't want to say anything about it. Besides, it was not like he was forcing me to do anything, so I was cool with it. Then they got married, and a couple of months after their marriage, my mother announced that she was planning to quit her job because she was pregnant again. I thought that was great news, and I was excited about having a little sibling, but at the same time, I didn't think that quitting her job would be the best move. The kind of control that Stephen seemed to have on her was really suspicious, and even though nothing bad had come out of it yet, I didn't think it was safe for my mother to just quit her job and completely rely on her husband. I tried to convince her several times not to quit her job, but she told me that it was none of my business, and that since I was a child, I should stick to doing things that kids do and not poke my nose where it doesn't belong. So after a while, I stopped trying to talk to her about these things and decided that she was a grown woman and she knew what was best for her, so she could do whatever she wanted to. I was also sick of her telling me to stay out of things that didn't concern me because I don't think she realized that the things that she did definitely concerned me because I was a part of the family as well. I was probably 15 or maybe 16 at the time, so it wasn't exactly as if I was a kid either. Anyway, I decided to stay out of it and mind my own business, but unfortunately, my mother lost the baby around 3 months into the pregnancy. It was devastating for her, and as a family, we took it hard. She was in her late 30s at the time, so the doctors said that the complications had happened because of her advanced age. Stephen was extremely disappointed, and there was a phase in their marriage after my mother lost her baby where two of them were sleeping in different rooms and were barely even speaking to each other. It was really sad because my mother was already going through something really upsetting, and to add to that, the only person that she should have been able to count on wasn't even talking to her. Apparently, he had told her that he needed some space to get his head on straight and process everything. So for a few months, they were basically just flatmates because they barely even talked about anything that didn't qualify as a household emergency. They would just discuss bills and groceries, and that's about it. During that time, my mother really opened up to me, and it helped me reconnect with her, which is what made everything much worse when she finally forced me to cut her off. When Stephen wasn't speaking to her, she had reached out to me and my grandparents, and we were the ones who were there for her. My grandmother has also fallen sick around the time that my mother lost her baby, and that was also probably part of the reason that she had started reconnecting with us. A couple of months later, my grandmother passed away, and a few weeks after the funeral, Stephen started putting in an effort into making my mom feel better again. So they started rebuilding their relationship, but I had already lost faith in the guy. I started disliking him because he had really lost my respect when he started giving my mother the cold shoulder after she lost the baby. I thought that it was a really low thing to do, and after that, I didn't ever consider trying to fix our relationship either. During the time that he was ignoring my mother, he also started giving me the cold shoulder. And he and I had even less to talk about than he did with my mother, so we were practically not even on speaking terms at the time. But anyway, after my grandmother's passing, he started trying to fix his relationship with my mother, but by then I had already made up my mind about him, and I knew that I didn't like him and I did not trust him. About a year after that, I left for college, and Stephen and my mother had started marriage counseling by that time, and they were doing great. On the weekends, I would try to visit them and would divide my time between my mother and my grandpa. My grandpa was really lonely after my grandma passed away, so I thought that it was really important for me to keep in touch with him. He was handling the bookstore business alone, and I had started thinking that after I graduated from college, I would start working at the bookstore and handle their finances or whatever. But I never got the opportunity to do so because a few weeks before my graduation, I received news from my mother that my grandfather had passed away in his sleep. I was glad that he had passed away peacefully, but I was also kind of upset that I didn't get a chance to say one last goodbye. To add to that, on the day of the funeral, my mother told me that his lawyer, who happened to be the executor of his will, had informally told her that she was going to inherit the bookstore business. I guess my grandpa hadn't changed his will before he passed on, and I was apparently going to inherit the house that my grandparents had lived in and I had spent the majority of my childhood, because even after I had moved out of that house with my mother, we would still frequently visit them. I was happy that I was going to inherit the house, and I knew that my mother didn't have any interest in running a bookstore. So I was planning on asking her to let me take over instead, because I thought that it would be a nice starting point for me, and it wasn't even as though the bookstore business was doing too badly, because it would still get customers, and the place was doing decent. A couple of weeks after the funeral, after the will had been read out, I decided to speak to my mother about it, but instead she told me that she had already spoken to Stephen and he had said that he was going to take over instead. I thought that was majorly unfair, because even though legally my grandpa had left the bookstore to her, I still felt like she should have allowed me to run the business. I tried to tell her that I had a special bond with my grandparents, and when my grandpa was alone after grandma had passed away, I had been helping him run the bookstore anyway, so I knew the finances, and I felt like it would have been fair for me to at least be a 50-50 partner in the business with Stephen, if that's really what my mother wanted. But she was very stubborn. and told me that she had already promised Stephen that she was going to let him take over the business and he was going to turn it into a franchise and take it to new heights, so I needed to stay out of his way. Truth be told, I didn't think that Stephen had it in him. Also, we were one of the exceptionally lucky bookstores that was still doing well in this era, so the idea of expanding the business seemed a little far-fetched and unachievable just yet. I thought that it would be better to start small and improve the one location that we did have. We had a lot of arguments about this, but a couple of days later, my mother told me that her decision was final and no amount of arguing was going to change her mind. So I needed to give up because apparently I was getting on her last nerve. She told me that she knew her own parents and they would want the same thing that Stephen wanted. So I needed to stay out of this because apparently I didn't know the situation as well as she did. She told me that Stephen had already been having a hard time at his workplace and had been thinking about quitting for quite some time. Now, he finally had the opportunity to do it with something to fall back on, and she told me that I was not going to take it away from him. She told me to drop all ideas of trying to take away the business from him, and if I couldn't do that, I could just leave them alone since I was already a grown-up and I could handle life on my own. That was a really nasty thing to say to me, especially to defend Stephen. My mother and I got into a really bad fight, and since that day, we hadn't spoken. I left the house that day, and after I graduated, I never heard from her or texted her ever again. She had made it very clear that either I would be okay with Stephen running the bookstore business or I could leave. So I had chosen to leave, and I was sticking to it. 7 years have passed since then, and a lot of things have changed. I graduated, moved into my own apartment, got my first job. I also started seeing my boyfriend, Dean, a couple of years ago. Life has been good, and I don't mind the way things turned out. Of course, I would really miss my mother occasionally, but then I would remember what she said to me the day that I left, and I would stop thinking about her. I would like to say that I had forgotten about my mom completely. And I had healed from everything, but that's not really the way it turned out. I didn't mind the fact that she wasn't speaking to me, but I couldn't help but feel like she was choosing Stephen over me. Deep down, I had always known that if it came down to it, she would always pick Stephen over me. I guess I had just hoped that I would be wrong, and when I wasn't, that shattered any illusions about my mother and effectively ended our relationship. I didn't even have my grandparents around anymore, so I had no reason to keep in touch with her. 7 years passed with zero news of her or how she was doing, since now I live in a different part of the city and we didn't have overlapping circles anyway. And I had already told my relatives that I didn't want to hear anything about her. I just wasn't interested because it would only hurt me. So to sum it up, I didn't know a thing about anything that my mother had been up to in the past 7 years, ever since I cut her off. But then, a couple of weeks ago, I finally heard from one of my cousins that my mother had been asking around for my phone number and address as she wanted to know if it was okay if she told my mother where I was living so she could come to visit me. I found it a little odd. But then again, I had changed numbers after I left, and I had blocked her on all forms of social media. So this was the only way that she could get to me. After some deliberation, I told my cousin that I was okay with it, because to be honest, I really wanted to know what it was that my mother wanted to speak to me about after so long. So I told her to go ahead and give her my address. A day after that, she visited me, and she came to me alone. I was a little surprised to see that Stephen hadn't accompanied her, but then again, we had never been that close, so it wasn't crazy. My mother and I had a tearful reconciliation, and after that, we got to talking. I told her all about my life, and I introduced her to Dean as well. She kept asking me about my job and how I was doing financially, which I thought was a little weird. But I didn't think much of it because it was natural for a mother to want to know how her kid was doing. The only thing that felt a bit off about it was the fact that we hadn't been in touch for almost 7 years, and all she wanted to know was about how well I was getting paid at my job. She probably could tell that I wasn't struggling because I had a nice lifestyle, which was reflected in the way I had done up my home. So, in spite of that, when she kept asking me subtle questions, I started to think that maybe there was something going on and maybe she had ulterior motives to come visit me. And after a while, she finally dropped the bomb on me and let go of any pretense that she had come over to fix things with me. She told me that she was glad to hear that I was doing great money-wise because she really needed my help. She told me that the bookstore business wasn't doing too well and Stephen was struggling to keep the business afloat. His great ideas of expanding and becoming a franchise hadn't really worked out for him, because now he had multiple locations but none of them was selling, and he had also taken a bunch of money from friends and family, which he now had to return. He had also put all their money into the business, but there were no returns. So they were struggling to even be able to pay their own bills. They couldn't even imagine what would happen if their friends and family started asking them to return the money that they had borrowed. They were in really bad trouble financially, so they wanted me to bail them out. My mother told me that she had come to see me because she wanted to talk to me about this, and while talking to me, she had already deduced that I made a decent income and I would be able to help them, at least a little. And if that wasn't embarrassing enough, she then proceeded to point at my boyfriend and said that since he was going to become a part of the family anyway, even Dean could contribute and help them keep the family business. I don't know why my mother thought that I was going to help her out like that, but the second that I realized that she had come here only for help and not to apologize, I decided to tell her that she could leave because I wasn't interested. And just to be clear, had he come to me with the intention of actually fixing things between us and making up for all the time that we had lost, maybe I would have even considered helping her out. But she only wanted my money, and the fact that she had dragged Dean into this as well, that just didn't sit right with me. So I decided to tell her to leave, and we got into another fight. She called me selfish and ungrateful and said that she regretted even trying to reach out to me. And I didn't hold back either and let out all of my frustration from when I was a child. After she left, Dean literally had to help me calm down for almost an hour because I had gotten worked up. I also found it really annoying that only my mother had shown up to ask for help when it was actually Stephen who had screwed everything up. I was just really pissed off about a lot of things, and that's why I refused to help them. My mother and I had had a strained and bad relationship ever since she got married to Stephen, and it had come to a breaking point almost 7 years ago. And recently I thought things were going to get better, but they didn't, and my disappointment and anger got the better of me, which is why I turned my mother away. She didn't speak to me again until a couple of days ago. I had also forgotten about the whole episode until she called me a few days back and told me that now they had no other option but to give up the business and sell everything because they were really struggling with money, and they had also told everyone who they had borrowed money from that the business wasn't doing well and everybody wanted their money back. She made it sound like it was all my fault and told me that had I just helped her out that day, not even for her sake, but for my grandparents, then this day wouldn't have come. But now they don't have anything left to give anymore, and selling is the only option that they had left. I know that I shouldn't feel guilty, but I do, and I don't know. I just feel like I've let my grandparents down. I know how much that bookstore business meant to them, and God knows it meant the same to me as well. So knowing that it's going to slip right out of my hands just isn't an easy fact to deal with. I could do something now, but I feel like my mother and Stephen haven't ordered it, and I don't want to go back on my word. But I also don't want to let the business go because then I would feel like a total jerk. So AITA for not bailing my parents out because the business that they had taken over instead of me wasn't doing too well? Update 1. Hi, so first off, thank you all so much for the comments on my post. I have thought about it and I have decided that I'm not going to help my mother directly, but like you all said, I really didn't want to let my parents screw up my grandparents' legacy. They had put a lot of hard work at something of their own, and I wasn't going to allow my parents to mess that up. So I decided to get in touch with a friend of mine, and together we decided to buy them out. I'm not going to screw my mother out of a fair price, and my friend is pretty rich since he has a restaurant business that he inherited from his father a couple of months ago. They have also been looking to expand, and they think that a bookstore plus cafe would be a perfect idea. So they're buying my parents out, and since I had approached him with this idea, I'm going to be their partner. The only thing that's left to do now is to speak to my mom. I'm just hoping that she hasn't found any other buyers yet, because that would complicate things. It seems unlikely, though, since it's just been a few weeks. I'm guessing nothing has been finalized yet. Anyway, I'm keeping my fingers crossed and hoping for the best. Update 2. So it's been 2 days since my last update, and half an hour ago, I just got off a phone call with my mother. I told her all about the idea that my friend and I had, and I mentioned to her that this would be a purely business deal, and that's it. I was speaking to her in a professional capacity, and she actually seemed open to the idea. She told me that she would talk to Stephen and let us know, so I think this is going to happen now. It's really exciting because I had always wanted something like this, and now I think it's actually going to materialize. Dean and I are already celebrating. Update 3. Okay, so it's been a couple of weeks since the last post here, but I've been really busy because my mother and Stephen agreed to our deal. They got their way out of the business, and now my friend and I have already taken over. There is a lot of renovation to be done, and we are overlooking all of it. It's a long way until we find and start making money off of this, but I'm hopeful. I know that my grandparents are going to be proud of me, and I just have this feeling that this is all going to work out for the best. I can't explain it, but I just know it. Now, all I need is everybody's blessings. Thank you so much to everybody who was there all along with me. Thank you for all the lovely comments and the messages. It really means the world to me. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.